Welcome in, everybody. Ready to dive into another declassified document.
Always.
This time we're looking at the 2016 New Hampshire primary.
A pivotal moment.
Absolutely. And get this, our source is a declassified CIA document.
Interesting.
It's actually an email chain focused on the Politico Playbook newsletter
Okay.
from February 9th, 2016, the day before the primary. It's like getting a peek behind the curtain.
Behind the curtain on what exactly?
On that day, into the campaigns, the media, even the White House.
Wow, a real fly-on-the-wall perspective.
Before we get into the weeds, though, could you remind us, why was New Hampshire so important in this election?
Well, for starters, this was the 100th anniversary of the New Hampshire primary. So historically, a pretty big deal. And being the first primary in the nation, it really sets the tone for the whole race.
Right. I was first, but that's a caucus.
Exactly. And this document, you can really feel the anticipation, as everyone's waiting for those results. It even mentions that all the major networks, they had wall-to-wall coverage planned.
It really does feel like they're bracing for, like, a political earthquake.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, even with all the election stuff going on, the Obama White House, they were still focused on, governing.
Right.
The playbook mentions Sean Donovan, Obama's budget director.
Okay.
And he's talking about pushing through the president's final budget.
So even while everyone's watching New Hampshire, the machinery of government, it keeps churning.
Yeah, it does. And it really suggests that Obama was, determined, to cement his legacy policy-wise, even as the battle for his successor is, raging on.
Speaking of battles, this email chain, it gives us some pretty interesting insight into the Clinton campaign. It seems like Hillary was already thinking about a staff shakeup even after Iowa.
Yeah, and she was reportedly unhappy with how the campaign was messaging things and with the digital operations, especially after her, surprisingly narrow win in Iowa.
Do you think those concerns, even at that early stage, do you think that foreshadowed any of the challenges that, that the Clinton campaign faced later?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it suggests that there were already some cracks showing, some tension, under the surface. There's even a tweet from David Axelrod, Obama's former strategist.
Oh, right.
Questioning whether the issues, the recurring issues in Clinton's campaigns, if they were, because of her.
Wow. That's adding fuel to the fire.
It does make you wonder, if there were any missed opportunities there to maybe course correct, address those weaknesses before they became big problems.
So while things were, a little shaky in the Clinton camp, Trump was riding high after that Iowa victory. The document even includes that New York Daily News cover, the one, depicting him as a clown.
Oh, yeah. Really highlighted how polarizing he was,
Yeah.
even way back then.
Right.
The Daily News also mentions Sarah Palin's endorsement, which, further emphasized that appeal he had to a certain segment of the electorate.
Yeah.
The ones who saw him as a political outsider, not part of the, the establishment.
Yeah. Right. And it's interesting to see how those narratives, they were already starting to form even before New Hampshire.
It is. And it kind of makes you wonder, how much influence those early narratives had on the outcome of the election. Did they help solidify people's perceptions of the candidates?
It's definitely something to think about as we keep going with this deep dive.
For sure.
Let's move on to another big name in the New Hampshire primary, Marco Rubio. The email chain actually shows a real split in how he was being portrayed at the time. He was seen as, this rising star, wasn't he?
He was. There are articles that, praised his performance. They highlighted, his youth, his energy, and they suggested that he could, appeal to a broader base of voters. But some articles were much more critical. Yeah. Some even labeled him Marco Roboto because of, his perceived tendency to repeat talking points.
So even this early on, there were already these, competing narratives about who Rubio was, what kind of candidate he'd be.
Exactly. And we see this all the time in politics, right? Attempts to define a candidate, to fit them into a certain, box, whether it's accurate or not.
It really highlights how important it is to be aware of these narratives, to really think about the information we're consuming.
Yeah, to question what we're being told, to look for those different perspectives.
Okay, so we've got Clinton potentially facing an uphill battle, Trump with all this momentum, and Rubio caught in the middle of these dueling perceptions, and all this just the day before the New Hampshire primary.
And we haven't even gotten to the really juicy stuff yet.
Oh.
This document, it also gives us these fascinating glimpses, behind the scenes of the campaigns and the media.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dig into that in part 2 of our deep dive. So we've got the scene set, right? 2016 New Hampshire, huge stakes.
Huge.
And this email chain, it really shows how much attention the media was giving this.
It was almost an obsession. I mean, every major network, they had planned extensive coverage all day, all night.
Yeah. It really does make you think, like, did all that attention, did it change how people saw the candidates?
I think that's a fair point. The media, they have a lot of power, to shape the story, especially during an election.
Speaking of stories, let's get back to Rubio for a second. That Marco Roboto thing, did that, stick with him through the whole campaign?
Well, it did play into this idea of him that he was, too scripted, lacking authenticity.
Right.
But there is something else interesting here. The email chain, it has some articles that actually praise him. They talk about how young he was, his energy, how he could appeal to a wider range of voters.
So even then it was complicated. Different people saw him differently.
Exactly. And that's something we see a lot in politics.
Yeah.
Right? People try to define a candidate, try to fit them into a box, whether it's, true or not.
It makes you realize we got to be careful, about just accepting what we hear. We have to think for ourselves about the information and where it's coming from.
Absolutely. We should always be questioning, looking for different viewpoints.
This document, it also gives us a peek behind the curtain, how campaigns really work.
Yeah. That detail about legal fees. They were hitting $1,500 an hour.
Whoa, that's a lot of money.
It is. It really shows you the stakes, how much pressure there is in these campaigns.
There's that thing about the Trump Hotel, the one in D.C. opening early.
Oh, right.
It's kind of poetic, Considering Trump ended up going from real estate to the White House.
It does make you think.
The document also mentions that Hillary Clinton, she was unhappy with how the campaign was handling digital stuff.
Yes.
Do you think that was a big deal?
I think it was. Especially because, for Trump, digital campaigning, social media, that became his main strategy.
Clinton, she was supposed to be the front runner, and she was already having problems there.
It seems like maybe they missed a chance to fix a weakness.
What if they had put more effort into digital strategy? Early on, I mean. Could that have changed things?
That's a good question. One that, historians will probably be debating for a long time.
It really shows you things can change quickly in politics. You have to be able to adapt.
You do.
So we've covered a lot, right? How important this primary was, how people saw the candidates differently, and even some behind-the-scenes stuff. But this email chain, it gives us more than that, I think.
It does. It gives us a view, of that day that we wouldn't get from, regular news sources.
It's we're right there with them, feeling all that tension.
Exactly. And that's why this document is so valuable. It gives us a level of, insight, context. That's really amazing.
And it reminds us that history, it's not just about the big events. It's about all these little moments, decisions that come together to change things.
It is. And that's why it's so important to, engage with history, to think critically about it, to try to understand how we got to where we are now.
Okay, so going into the last part of our deep dive, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from this so far? It's amazing, right? How this, random email chain can tell us so much.
Right. It was just sitting there in the archives. But it gives us this, incredible view of what was happening.
Totally. It's like a time capsule. We get to see what people were thinking, worried about on that day.
It shows that history, it's not just about, the big famous stuff.
Yeah.
It's about all those little decisions, the things that happen every day, and how they, that they add up.
It's all about context, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
This document, it gives us this whole other way of looking at the 2016 primary. We're not just getting the, the official story.
Right. It's not just the headlines. We see it through the eyes of the people who are, actually there in the middle of everything.
It reminds you that there's always, more to the story than what you see on the surface.
Absolutely. There's all this stuff happening behind the scenes, different sides trying to control the story, agendas,
It makes you think, we have to be careful about what we believe.
We have to question things, look for different perspectives.
Yeah.
Don't just take things at face value.
So thinking about everything that happened in 2016 and after, how do you think these glimpses into the campaign, into the media back then, how do they change how we understand it all?
That's a really interesting question. I think it makes us, look deeper. What were the things that really led to that outcome?
Yeah.
It's not just one event. It's, all these choices, all these actions. And the media was a part of it. How they presented things, what was happening inside the campaigns, and just the people involved, their personalities.
It's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shows that history is not just about the past.
Yeah.
It's about understanding where we are now and where we're going.
It makes you wonder what other, secrets are out there hidden in those archives.
Right. That's the cool thing about history. There's always something new to discover, more to learn.
It reminds us that we should never stop exploring, keep asking questions.
Exactly. Understanding the past, that's how we figure out the present and how we, make the future better.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
Happy to be here. This stuff is always fascinating.